I would like to dedicate the remainder of this episode to telling you about the efforts of constructing lingua francas. That is, constructing them by sitting down and painstakingly creating the grammar, the phonetics, the dictionary, and carefully tying it all together to make a functional language. I would like to talk about it not only because it's interesting, but also out of the sheer respect for the effort and thought that have been invested into these projects. Designing an artificial language is a tremendously ambitious task, and probably typically taken up by very ambitious people. It is then no wonder that a very large share of these languages were designed to become the world's lingua francas. The first relative success in this field was achieved by Volapük, constructed by Johann Martin Schleyer in the 1880s. Johann was a Roman Catholic priest in Baden, Germany, and reportedly woke up one morning having received a command from the god to construct an international language that would foster greater understanding between the nations and thereby help achieve world peace. This is in fact the motivation behind the creation of many constructed languages. In any case, Volapük had his grammar made up of typically Indo-European traits and vocabulary, mostly adapted from English, German, and French. The language, and what it stands for, quickly found a large band of admirers. Almost a decade later, in 1889, there were an estimated 283 language clubs, 25 periodicals in or about Volapük, and 316 textbooks in 25 languages. But about 1,000 kilometers to the east, another proposal for a global lingua franca has already made its first steps into the public. We are, of course, talking about Esperanto. It was created in the late 1870s to early 1880s by a Polish-Jewish ophthalmologist from Białystok, now in northeastern Poland, called Ludwig Leitzer Zamenhof. Here's an extract from his letter to a friend explaining why he took upon the task of creating a global language. The place where I was born and spent my childhood gave direction to all my future struggles. In Białystok, the inhabitants were divided into 4 distinct elements: Russians, Poles, Germans, and Jews. Each of these spoke their own language and looked on all the others as enemies. In such a town, a sensitive nature feels more acutely than elsewhere the misery caused by language division and sees at every step that the diversity of languages is the first, or at least the most influential basis for the separation of the human family into the groups of enemies. I was brought up as an idealist. I was taught that all people were brothers, while outside in the street, at every step, I felt that there were no people, only Russians, Poles, Germans, Jews, and so on. This was a great torment to my infant mind, although many people may smile at such an anguish for the world in a child. Since that time, I always thought that grown-ups were omnipotent, so I often said to myself that when I grew up, I would certainly destroy this evil. Zamenhof's Esperanto, that translates to the one that hopes, was in essence another Indo-European language. The phonetics and the semantics were essentially Slavic, whereas the vocabulary derives primarily from the Romance languages, with lesser contributions from Germanic, Slavic, and Greek. By 1887, the first Esperanto grammar book was published in Warsaw. It caught on quickly, first in the Russian Empire and in Central Europe. Later, it spread into Western Europe and the Americas. It quickly cast a shade over Volapük, becoming the widest spoken constructed language in the history of the world. Numerous language clubs, publications, and conferences. It even made it to the school curriculums in Hungary and China. Amongst the most enthusiastic Esperantists, even an emerging population of native speakers had started to emerge. Since 1905, Esperanto Congress has been held in a different country each year. And indeed, in the year 1905, one could have said that Esperanto was off to a great start in terms of achieving the goals of its creator within the next century. But as we all know now, Esperanto is far from a global lingua franca. So what happened? The core of Esperanto enthusiasts were based in the location of its origin, somewhere in between Central and Eastern Europe. During the World War I, many dreams of world unity and peace had fallen apart. The annual Esperanto Congress did not take place for the first time since 1905. And even though it had restarted after the war, Esperanto had started to decline in popularity. That can again be, to a large extent, attributed to the political developments in the region.
In 1923, if I'm not mistaken, there was a vote in the League of Nations on making Esperanto another official language in the League of Nations, but it was the French who killed the vote. So it is also telling, because the French wanted the French language to continue as a language of diplomacy and as a language of quote unquote what used to be called high culture.
On one side, Germany was crumbling under the weight of retributions they have committed to paying for starting and losing the war, as well as the rampant inflation with its citizens stuck in a miserable state of poverty and uncertainty. With the National Socialist Party, or the Nazis, eventually coming to power, and Hitler seeing Esperanto as a part of global Jewish conspiracy, its speakers became targets of persecution. In the Eastern Front, in the newly formed Soviet Union, Esperanto was first embraced. Actually, revolutionist and Esperantist ideologies made for quite a good match. Both were talking about unity and equality between all, regardless of one's nationality or trade. This relationship worked quite fine in the beginning, while the Soviet ideals of, quote, bringing the light of communism to the world were still at least somewhat observed. Over time, however, especially with Joseph Stalin in power of the Soviet Union, it started transforming into a paranoid closed state. Eventually, nearly any form of activism was rendered a danger to the regime, and the Esperanto community was effectively broken down. Meanwhile, in smaller Eastern European states that, after a long break, enjoyed their freedom from imperial powers, all focus was drawn to a somewhat fetishist nationalism, pushing Esperanto and the ideas that came with it aside. That being said, the language has survived. In his own words, Zamenhof wanted mankind to learn and use, en masse, the proposed language as a living one. Not sure about the en masse part, but Esperanto, at least on a small scale, fulfilled Zamenhof's dream. With an exception of the years in world wars, annual Esperanto conventions are still ongoing since 1905. There are around 3.5 Esperanto books published per year, and a group of 2,000 native speakers. A quick interesting fact, George Soros is actually one of them. There are also some non-profit organizations which use it as their official language. Vatican runs an Esperanto language radio. It's the official language in the International Academy of Sciences of San Marino. Also, China uses it in China Radio International. All in all, Esperanto, although not as impressive as envisioned, still holds as the constructed language that came the closest to becoming a global lingua franca.
Esperanto is a pretty successful lingua franca these days. What is interesting, you have Esperanto users all around the world. Yeah? If you are a member of this network, it functions like an extended family or like preferential tourist network. Wherever you go to a country you don't know the language of, you can find Esperantists and be wined, dined, and shown around. And knowing Esperanto, you don't know any other language, but still you can communicate all over the world, including Vietnam, including China, Korea, you name it. Yeah, I will give you an example from my own field. I don't know Albanian. Yeah, and I wanted to go to Albania and to do research and to understand what's going on. Yeah, and that's not easy. Until recently, they didn't know other languages I speak, yeah, like English. Yeah. And let's say I could cheat my way in Serbo-Croatian, but in Kosovo they would hate to speak it. Yeah, so it was no go, truly speaking. I can understand Italian, but I cannot talk it. Yeah, so I was kind of put. What to do? Yeah, okay. I have an Esperanto friend. Do you know some Esperanto guys in Albania who could show me around and connect me to some other scholars? Yeah, no problem. So, truly speaking, I wrote several articles on Albanian issues through this Esperanto connection, not even knowing Esperanto. But obviously, I'm a kind of lying and not knowing Esperanto. Because if you know one Germanic or Romance language, and actually English is both, you know Esperanto. Very often when I check up Wikipedia, I check up Esperanto Wikipedia because it has a great slant, non-national slant on a lot of issues when it comes to history and politics. So I encourage you to check up the Esperanto Wikipedia.
There have been more recent attempts to construct a global lingua franca too. For example, in 2010, a group of enthusiasts from St. Petersburg constructed Lingua de Planeta, a mix of 10 most spoken languages in the world, namely English, Chinese, Hindi, Spanish, French, Arabic, Russian, Portuguese, German, and Persian. Actually, if the language were truly based on the 10 most spoken languages in the world, Bengali and Indonesian should be there instead of German and Persian. In any case, the idea section of the official website of Lingua de Planeta outlines the desired qualities of global lingua franca, and among them is the trait that might be responsible for all of the attempts to construct lingua francas: neutrality. Indeed, if the goal would only be to simply have a single universally understood language, the easiest way to go about achieving it would be to teach everyone the currently most popular language out there, in our case, English. People who construct artificial languages, however, believe that the lingua franca should be impartial, not favor any one people group in particular. Indeed, if everyone was just forced to learn English, the native speakers of it would have what some might call an unfair advantage. I trust that many of you will know how hard it is to sound smart and serious in a language that you don't have a full command of. Having said that, all most notable attempts of constructing an impartial language have resulted in further establishing the already mentioned bias towards Eurasian languages, and most of them favoring Indo-European languages in particular. In this sense, all of the constructed languages failed, and quite possibly because they were facing an impossible task. I would argue that it is impossible to construct an objectively fair and impartial lingua franca, simply because the definition of what is fair, well, it's up to debate.
Esperanto, from today's perspective of the decolonized world, is not as neutral as it used to be, because you have to remember it was written, still is, in the Latin script, and the Latin script is connected to the West. Yeah? And it is built from Romance elements and Germanic elements, so it is not easy to understand for people all around the world. Yeah, it is easy to understand for people who know a Romance language or a Germanic language.